Let me tell you a story that even in my wildest dreams I could never have imagined living. I'm Mariana, I'm 25 years old, and I'm going to tell you how what started with sly looks from my father-in-law ended in a scandal with my boyfriend. It all started on a sunny Saturday morning. My boyfriend, Andres, called me in that honeyed voice that always makes me smile. He told me he had a surprise for me and that I should come to his house that night. Excitement ran through every fiber of my body. I couldn't wait to find out what he was up to. My relationship with Andres was something special. We had known each other since high school, and, despite some silly fights, we had managed to build something strong and genuine. He was the kind of guy every girl would envy, and sometimes I surprised myself by having him by my side. He worked at a technology company and was always busy. But he still always found time for me. That night I arrived at his house very excited and thinking about what the surprise could be. Andres greeted me with a beaming smile and hugged me tightly. "I have to go to work early tomorrow, but I would like you to stay. How about sleeping here?" he proposed. Although the first thing that went through my mind was a resounding yes, the occupation of my presence delaying him the next day made me hesitate a bit. But he assured me that he would be fine and that we would enjoy the night together. As we spent time in the living room, I couldn't help but notice how his father, Mr. Rodriguez, kept looking at me. He was a strong, mature man with a deep, penetrating gaze that always made me a little uncomfortable. Over the months, I had noticed how he followed my movements with his eyes, as if he was calculating every step I took. I always tried to ignore those thoughts, convincing myself that they were just my imagination. Here I am, trying to put into words a part of my life that, well, is pretty hard to explain. If someone had told me a few months ago that I would be in the middle of this craziness, I wouldn't have believed it in my wildest dreams. But, well, here we go. Before that day when my boyfriend Andres invited me to sleep at his house, things took a turn that I could not have imagined. Mr. Rodriguez, his dad, had always looked at me a little differently. It was as if his eyes had a magnet that attracted me, but I tried to ignore it. After all, he was my father-in-law, and having weird thoughts didn't even cross my mind. But as the days and weeks went by, those intense staring encounters started to become more and more frequent. Whenever I was around, whether I was in the living room watching a movie or in the kitchen preparing dinner, I noticed that his eyes followed my every move. It seemed as if he wanted to read my thoughts, and the way he looked at me sent a shiver down my spine. I can't help it, I still remember that day when I was helping Mrs. Rodriguez set the table for the family dinner. As I folded the napkins, I felt his gaze on me intense and deep. I felt uncomfortable, but I couldn't do much, other than smile nervously and try to keep the conversation as normal as possible. Inside, though, my mind was a whirlwind of questions and conflicting emotions. The funny thing is that, despite feeling those desire-laden stares, I went on with my life. Andres and I were still a happy couple, and whenever I felt uncomfortable with his dad's stare, I just tried to avoid the subject and focus on my relationship with him. After all, there was no point in dwelling on things that I assumed were only in my head. The months leading up to that particular day were filled with strange moments. Sometimes, when everyone was in the living room watching a movie, Mr. Rodriguez and I would find ourselves in the kitchen alone for a moment. In those moments, our conversations would become longer and more personal. We would share anecdotes and thoughts that we had not shared with anyone else. It was as if we had a special connection, something I could not explain, but could not ignore. I don't know exactly when things started to change. It was as if the air itself became charged with desire every time we were near. Every chance encounter in the house became a dangerous game of glances and whispered words. I knew it was wrong, that I was crossing lines I shouldn't be crossing, but sometimes it's hard to stop when you're drawn to something you can't quite understand. So here I am, trying to sort out my thoughts and emotions, as I navigate this unfamiliar terrain. I can't help but wonder how we got to this point, and if there is any way to turn back. My mind is a whirlwind of doubt, and as I move forward in this story, I know there is no turning back. What follows is an uncertain and dangerous path, and I have no idea how we will get out of this. So, we came to that day when I stayed over at Andre's house. After dinner, we all sat in the living room, his mom, his dad, Andres, and me. We chatted, laughed, and had a good time. It was one of those family nights that we enjoyed together, and everything seemed as normal as always. Finally, we decided to watch a movie together. We settled on the couch with Andrew next to me, his dad in his favorite chair and his mom on the other couch. The movie started and, honestly, I had a hard time remembering what it was about. My mind was somewhere else, lost, full of emotions and thoughts. After a while, Andres and I decided it was time to retire for a rest. We got up from the couch as we headed to the room I shared with him. I felt a knot in my stomach. Everything seemed normal, but there was something in the air, a tension that made me nervous. We got into the room and Andres closed the door behind us. He looked at me with that smile that always made me feel special and took my hand. At that moment, everything seemed to be in order. But my thoughts were elsewhere, and I couldn't get those intense looks and the weight of what was going on between me and her dad out of my mind. We lay down on the bed and continued talking for a while. She told me about her plans for the weekend, her job, and other light topics. I tried to keep the conversation flowing, but every time I looked into her eyes, I couldn't help but feel like she was hiding something. It was as if the weight of our shared secrets was in the room with us. Finally, we turned out the light and settled down to sleep. But despite my tiredness, my mind was everywhere but asleep. My thoughts were spinning, and my conscience was struggling to stay afloat in the midst of this turmoil. I knew something was wrong, that our actions were not just innocent conversations or shared glances. In the midst of the darkness, I felt that the room was full of secrets. I couldn't help but wonder if Andres knew something, if he suspected something strange between me and his father. But then, why would he continue to act normal? It was as if we lived in two different worlds, one full of laughter and moments together as a couple and another dark and dangerous one, which I only shared with Mr. Rodriguez. Time passed slowly, and the clock's ticking face seemed to resonate in my head. Andres was sound asleep next to me, oblivious to the storm that was going through my mind. I tossed and turned in bed, unable to find a comfortable position. And as I struggled to find sleep, a part of me knew that this was just the beginning of something much more complicated and dangerous. After all the thoughts of the night before, I finally managed to fall asleep. The bed in Andrew's room was comfortable, and exhaustion overcame me despite my worries. My eyes closed and, for a while, I was able to rest from everything that was going on. However, as they say, all good things must come to an end at some point. It was 7 in the morning when I was awakened by the sound of Andres' alarm clock. Although I was still half asleep, I knew I had to go to work early. I felt him stirring in bed and then the sound of the shower water. It was clear that she was following her daily routine before going out. Even though I had my eyes closed, I was aware of every little noise in the house. I heard Andrew's footsteps as he moved around the room, picking out his clothes and looking for his things. And then, suddenly, I felt him lean over me and give me a soft kiss on my forehead. "I have to go to work, honey. I don't want to wake you up, get some more rest," she said softly. Those moments before he left were strange. I knew he was leaving me at home alone with his parents. Although I had always had a good relationship with them, I now felt a tension in the air that I couldn't ignore. As I heard the door close behind him, my heart beat faster. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in the semi-darkness. The house was quiet and, for a moment, the reality of the situation hit me hard. I was alone in my in-laws' house, and everything that had been going on between me and Mr. Rodriguez felt like a shadow looming over me. My thoughts went back to the night before those intense looks and shared conversations. I felt caught in a tangle of emotions that I could not control. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, that I was jeopardizing my relationship with Andrew and the stability of his family. But the attraction I felt towards his father was like an unstoppable force pulling me towards him. Time passed slowly while I was alone in the house. I listened to the occasional noises from outside, but for the most part one was immersed in my thoughts. I wondered how I had gotten to this point and what the hell I was going to do about it. My conscience was weighing on me, and each passing second seemed to compound the guilt I felt. Finally, I decided to get up and face the day. I stood up and looked around the room. There was no trace of Andrew, only a few of his belongings were scattered around the place. I stretched and yawned, trying to push the worries out of my mind. Although I knew that facing his parents would be uncomfortable, I couldn't stay in bed forever. With a sigh, I decided to take a bath and spruce up a bit. As the warm water ran over me, I felt a little more awake and focused. Maybe it was time to face reality and try to put this whole mess I had created in order. I didn't know how I would do it, but I was determined to find a solution. If you have ever felt your life turn 180 degrees in a second, then you know exactly what I was feeling right now. After the shower, I decided to go to Andre's room to change. I wrapped myself in a towel and carefully opened the bathroom door. I walked towards the room, and as I was about to enter, the world seemed to stop for an instant. Guess who was there? Yes, Mr. Rodriguez, my father-in-law. I can't believe this is happening. I don't know who was more surprised, if he heard. We were standing there in a moment of pure awkwardness and surprise. His gaze swept up and down me, and I felt my skin bristle under his scrutiny. That moment felt like an eternity, and my thoughts flew into overdrive. How had it come to this moment? How had we gone from intense stares to being in this awkward situation? Finally, I managed to stammer out a few words. "I'm sorry, I didn't know you were here," I said, my voice shaky with embarrassment. He smiled a kind of smile that sent shivers down my spine. "Don't worry, Mariana. You have nothing to hide," he replied in a quiet voice, but laden with innuendo. What happened next is hard to describe. Instead of walking away or apologizing for the unwelcome encounter, Mr. Rodriguez began to flirt with me. It was as if he was playing with fire, but I couldn't help but be drawn to the energy I had always felt toward him. I kept telling myself that I should walk away, that this was wrong and pointless, but my feet seemed glued to the ground. The conversation became more intense, loaded with double entendres and suggestive gestures. I don't know how it happened, but in the midst of that tension we got even closer. And before I knew it, we were facing each other, our gazes fixed on each other, the air was full of electricity, and every part of my being was alert. That's when it happened. A brush, a minimal gesture but charged with desire, and suddenly everything changed. My lips met his, in a kiss that defied all rules and limitations. It was as if the world vanished around us, and only he and I existed at that moment. It was a mixture of emotions, excitement and guilt that intertwined inside me. I can't lie to you. That moment was passionate and intense. But it was also a turning point in my life. A line we crossed without thinking about the consequences. I didn't know what was going to happen after this, how I would deal with Andrew and how I would deal with the burden of what I had done. But in that instant I was caught in a vortex of emotions and desires that left me breathless. Then Mr. Rodriguez and I parted slightly, both of us with bated breath. We didn't need words to understand what had just happened. But there was a new level of tension in the air, and the weight of our actions began to weigh more heavily than ever. After that moment in Andre's room, we were in the midst of changing, trying to assimilate what had happened. My mind was in total chaos and I didn't know how to deal with what we had done. But then, in the midst of that sea of thoughts, the worst happened. The door suddenly opened and my heart stopped in my chest. It was Mrs. Rodriguez. His mother. She looked at me with surprise and her expression went from shock to confusion and finally to disappointment. At that moment, I felt the world collapsing around me. I didn't know what to say or do, so I just froze, unable to find the words. The tension in the room was palpable. Mrs. Rodriguez looked from me to her husband, and in her eyes was a mixture of anger and sadness. I knew something was going on, that our actions had been discovered. I felt my face burn with shame, and my body trembled from the intensity of the situation. I didn't know how it could have come to this, how I had crossed a line I should never have crossed. The confrontation began with an awkward silence. Mrs. Rodriguez turned to her husband with a voice full of restrained fury. "What is going on here? Raphael, how could it come to this?" Her voice trembled with emotion, and I felt like an intruder in the middle of a fight I should not have witnessed. Her husband's response was an unintelligible mumble, and although I couldn't hear him, I could feel the weight of his words in the air. I didn't know what to say, how to explain the inexplicable. My mind was racing, looking for a way out, a way to escape this disaster. But I knew there was no way back, no way to erase what had happened. Mrs. Rodriguez looked directly at me, and her gaze was a mixture of sadness and disappointment. I felt like a child caught in the act, and a sense of guilt came over me. She sighed, and her words came out as a pained whisper. "I thought you were part of our family, Mariana. I never imagined you would do something like this." I couldn't bear her gaze any longer. I felt like I was falling apart, that everything I had built was vanishing before my eyes. I tried to speak, but my voice broke into an uncontrollable sob. "I'm sorry," I managed to say through tears. "I never meant for this to happen, I'm so sorry." Mrs. Rodriguez turned and walked out of the room, leaving me and her husband in an overwhelming silence. I knew at that moment that there was no way to repair the damage I had caused, that I had destroyed something I should never have touched. I felt guilty, ashamed, and lost all at the same time. Finally, Raphael turned to me, his gaze full of sadness and guilt. "This should not have happened, Mariana. It was a serious mistake." His voice was a hoarse whisper, and his expression was a mixture of guilt and anguish. Mrs. Rodriguez returned, and on her face was a flash of determination. "I ask you to leave this house," she said in a firm voice. "What you did is unforgivable, and I don't want to see you here ever again." My tears were still flowing, and though I wanted to apologize over and over again, I knew my words were meaningless now. I got out of bed, my body shaking, and gathered my things in a mechanical act. I knew there was no way to fix what I had done, that I would have to carry this guilt for the rest of my life. After that devastating day at my in-laws' house, things were never the same again. The tension was too great, and although I tried to talk to Andres and explain what had happened, it was to no avail. Our relationship, which once seemed strong and unbreakable, collapsed like a house of cards. The conversation with Andres was painful and tearful. I tried to explain the inexplicable, I tried to apologize and ask for forgiveness, but his eyes were full of disappointment and tradition. There was no way to fix what I had done, no way to turn back time and erase that dark chapter of our lives. The worst part was accepting that not only had I lost Andres, but I had also destroyed the relationship between his father and mother. My in-laws' marriage, which had once seemed solid, had broken down because of my irresponsible and selfish actions. The confrontation I witnessed between them that day was the beginning of the end of their relationship, and the weight of that guilt rests on my shoulders. The truth is that I felt miserable. I felt the weight of guilt and shame every day, and I knew I deserved all of that and more. I had betrayed the trust of the people who mattered most in my life, and it haunted me. Not only had I lost my boyfriend, but I had also lost my own integrity and values. The next step was to face the consequences of my actions in everyday life. I had lost an important part of my life, and that left a void in my heart that I didn't know how to fill. I tried to move on, tried to find a way to fix everything, but I couldn't escape the truth of what I had done. The gaze of my friends and family was laden with judgment and unspoken questions. They all knew what had happened, and although I tried to hide my shame behind a smile, I knew I couldn't fool anyone. I had damaged my reputation and my integrity, and that was something I couldn't ignore. Thank you for being a part of this gripping story of infidelity. If you want to continue to enjoy and explore other exciting stories, I invite you to subscribe. Join our community so you won't miss a single video. Click the subscribe button to receive instant updates on upcoming stories. I look forward to seeing you in our next video. Don't miss it, subscribe now and discover a world of fascinating stories.